I am delighted to welcome Dr. Bobo. He is one of the leading scholars of Russian foreign policy, a prolific writer. He has been an Australian diplomat. He has been associated and is still associated with Chatham House, with the Center for European Reform. And I'm not going to mention all of his publications, but two of them are particularly relevant. One of them that came out in 2008 is The Axis of Convenience, which is the book on Russian-Chinese relations, which still continues to resonate. And his latest book, Russia and the New World Disorder, just came out a few months ago, has been very well received, and talks about the challenges to Russia in this rather disorderly world. So we're really delighted that he could come here and be our keynote speaker. And the title that he has given his talk today is The Eurasian Union: Drivers, Aspirations, and Realities. Bobo, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Angela. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I've really enjoyed the panels. I'm learning so much. I hope I can give at least a little bit back. I'm proceeding today on the basis that it's impossible to understand the Eurasian Economic Union without seeing it in its broader international context. On the surface, it is simply another in the long line of Eurasian integration projects. Alex Cooley pointed that out earlier today. These projects have been sort of attempted at various stages in the last 25 years with generally poor returns. But, you know, the agenda of another regional integration project seems pretty natural, inoffensive, so why not let it ride? And this interpretation, this relaxed attitude that some people advocate, is all the more plausible given that regional integration projects today are all the rage. The deadlock in global trade negotiations, the disorderliness of the international environment, the failure of globalist solutions. People are sort of increasingly looking towards regionalism and the regionalization of solutions, as Alex and Feng Xiaolei have pointed out. And yet, the Eurasian Union, or Eurasian Economic Union, has been nothing if not controversial since Vladimir Putin outlined it in October 2011. As you know, Hillary Clinton described it as an attempt by Moscow to re-Sovietize the region. And she's not alone in thinking that. I would say that that's quite a common trope. So what I want to do over the next 30 minutes is to talk about the Eurasian Union, its drivers, aspirations, and realities. And I'm going to start with the drivers behind Putin's Eurasian Union, because it is Putin's conception of the Eurasian Union that I'm going to be talking about. But I also want to talk about the goals of the other players, Kazakhstan, Belarus. Then I want to discuss external factors, external players. We've already had a little bit of discussion about that, but I want to sort of develop it a little bit more, if I may. I also want to sort of come up with a preliminary assessment of how well or badly it's done, the scorecard, if you like. And then I want to finish with a couple of scenarios, or 3 scenarios, for the future of Eurasian integration and the Eurasian Union. So starting off with drivers behind Putin's vision of a Eurasian Union. And I think the drivers are quite many and complex, but I'm going to put them in the order I think they should go. I think the first primary driver is strategic design. In his 2011 statement, Vladimir Putin said, I envisage a powerful supranational association capable of becoming one of the poles of the modern world and serving as an efficient bridge between Europe and the dynamic Asia-Pacific region. Now, this is absolutely consistent with his determined pursuit of a multipolar order, or if you like, polycentric system of international relations, in which Russia is one of three independent centers of global power, along with the United States and China. And just as the United States is seen to lead the West, and China is emerging as the leader of the East, or regional superpower in East Asia, so Putin seeks to reassert Russia's dominance over the geopolitical space, the пространство of the former Soviet Union, a kind of 21st century Eurasian heartland. Second driver, political consolidation. Putin seeks to consolidate a kind of normative or political like-mindedness across the post-Soviet space. And this has become especially important in the wake of the anti-Putin protests of late 2011, early 2012, the Maidan revolution, and of course, the ongoing crisis in relations between Russia and the West. Now, the main purpose of this normative solidarity is to counter not radical Islam, not the three evils, it's to counter the subversive influence of Western liberalism. Post-Soviet Eurasia, in Putin's worldview, represents a forward defense zone of authoritarian values, or otherwise also known as traditional spiritual moral values, whose consolidation is key to Russia's stability. And Eurasian integration via the Eurasian Union supports this overarching goal. Now, more broadly, Putin seeks an alternative ideational and geopolitical and political legitimacy that challenges Western notions of good governance, of international morality. Now, at the global level, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, serves this purpose. But regionally, this function is carried out by the Eurasian Union. It's the instrument of choice in the post-Soviet space. And it helps here, of course, that the other main actors in the Eurasian Union, Kazakhstan and Belarus, are, of course, authoritarian regimes. So, for the Kremlin, this kind of authoritarian alliance or authoritarian concordat is complementary also to its geopolitical objectives. In much the same way that a liberal consensus has supplied the foundation for NATO and EU projecting influence, so Putin hopes that solidarity within the Eurasian Union on the basis of shared values will perform a similar function, will create a more integrated approach toward the world and to the West in particular. Now, in this enterprise, cultural and civilizational unity play an important, although subordinate, role. Moscow's purpose here, when he talks about civilizational cultural unity, is not evangelical, but instrumental. Promoting Russian culture and language is, of course, a desirable aim in itself. But really, it is secondary to the larger purpose of consolidating a broader Moscow-led consensus across post-Soviet Eurasia in which the various dimensions, strategic, political, economic, civilizational, are mutually reinforcing. Now, paradoxically, economic integration, I think, is the least important rationale behind the Eurasian Economic Union. Although in theory the Eurasian Union offers a dedicated, protected space for intra-EU trade. In reality, it adds very little to what is already there. Indeed, as we shall see later, the EU has actually complicated trading relations between its members. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by the relatively low priority of economic integration, because I don't think Moscow's intention was ever to create an economic union along the lines of the EU, even though Putin talks about that in his 2011 article. I think a closer model, certainly not an exact model, but a closer model is Comecon in Soviet times. And this Comecon's purpose, strategic purpose, was to reinforce Moscow's economic control over the nominally sovereign states of Eastern Europe. Another key driver is the quest for legitimation. The EU provides multilateral cover, multilateral respectability for the pursuit of Russian national interests. It represents a kind of soft power, persuading the ex-Soviet republics that their interests are best served by aligning with Moscow. And underpinning all these drivers, is a powerful sense of entitlement. Now, I completely agree with Alex that Moscow has no intention of trying to recreate the Soviet Union. I think that's a distraction. But there is an implicit expectation in the Kremlin that the ex-Soviet republics will respect Russia's dominant position in the post-Soviet space, be sensitive to its interests, and do nothing, or very little, to offend it. In other words, you can look at the Eurasian Union as a kind of modern instrument, co-optation rather than coercion, designed, however, to achieve rather traditional objectives of projecting power and influence. Well, so much for Russia. What about the others? Where do they stand? Well, I think the goals of the other member states, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, really are largely a function of their size. Starting off with Kazakhstan, since we've mainly spoken about it rather than Belarus today. It's true that Nazarbayev was the first leader to push Eurasian integration in 1994, something that, for example, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov likes to remind us of. His reasons then, I think, were to underpin Kazakhstan's economic growth, facilitating free trade with Russia, on which the Kazakhstan economy was and remains very closely tied. Now, Astana's primary motivation for staying in and supporting the Eurasian Union in some form is still primarily economic. Now, 2 decades later, Kazakhstan's economy is, of course, much more developed, much more open. But the goal of Eurasian integration remains desirable in principle. The question is, however, what kind of integration are we talking about? And here, Astana's position differs fundamentally from Moscow's. Because whereas the Kremlin envisages a kind of multidimensional, comprehensive integration and consolidation of a post-Soviet space under Russian leadership, Nazarbayev's primary goal is to preserve Kazakhstan's sovereignty and distinct national identity. There can be no compromise on these fundamentals. So accordingly, and utterly unsurprisingly, Nazarbayev and other senior Kazakhs have criticized the politicization of the Eurasian Union. They've opposed the transition to a single currency. And they've also been careful to retain control over trade and immigration. And more broadly, consistent with this policy, this careful approach, Nazarbayev has pursued a multi-vectored foreign policy, balancing between China, Russia, and the West. I mean, it's really the classic hedging strategy of smaller states in dealing with great powers, particularly ones that are in their immediate proximity. Now, I think Nazarbayev's model of integration, inverted commas, is not the EU with its pooling of sovereignty. No, no, no. His model of integration is actually ASEAN. In other words, the goal here is not integration, but association and cooperation. Now, the importance of favoring association rather than integration is reinforced by four critical factors. First, the disproportionate size and influence power of Russia relative to the other Eurasian Union member states. Second, the historical baggage of Russia as the former imperial power. It was only 25 years ago, after all. The third is Putin's determination to restore Russia as a global great power and regional superpower. And the fourth, of course, events in Ukraine. Belarus. Belarus's goals in the Eurasian Union are actually broadly similar to those of Kazakhstan. The primary motivation for engagement in the Eurasian Union is economic. But like with Nazarbayev, President Lukashenko's overriding objective here is to safeguard national sovereignty and his own personal authority. No less important, of course. Now, the main differences between Belarus and Kazakhstan are that, of course, the Belarus economy is much more reliant on direct Russian support. Belarus also has a much more vulnerable strategic location. It is on the historical invasion path from west to Russia. And of course, then there is Lukashenko's rather conspicuous limitations as a leader, which have made him especially reliant on support from the Kremlin. Now, like Nazarbayev, Lukashenko has pursued a balancing approach between Moscow and the EU, but he's done so, I would say, rather less successfully. More recently, however, there are signs he may be becoming a little bit more skillful at this, or maybe the EU is just a bit more gullible. Hard to know sometimes. Now, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, basically for them, membership of the Eurasian Union is overwhelmingly politically motivated. Yeah, Armenia's largest trading partner is the EU, Kyrgyzstan's is China, but the two countries basically had very little option but to join the Eurasian Union. Armenia's need for Russian political and military support is especially strong, given concerns about the Nagorno-Karabakh and also military modernization in Azerbaijan. The Kyrgyzstan economy is unbelievably dependent on Russia. I was looking at, when I was researching this, that Kyrgyzstan is the world's second most remittance-dependent country, just after Tajikistan. So annoying the Russians would not only risk losing revenue, but what do you do with all these Kyrgyz who are going to come back and create a massive unemployment and, of course, social instability problem? I want to talk about external players now. Let's start off with the EU. Unwittingly, the EU is responsible for the emergence of the Eurasian Union as a serious Kremlin project. They rather sleepwalked into this, but yeah, let's let's not kick a man or an institution while it's down too much. The Eastern Partnership, underwhelming and underfunded as it has been and was, nevertheless set a whole train of events that ended, one way or another, in the Russian annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in southeastern Ukraine. Today, this Eastern Partnership, still weak, still underfunded, represents the dominant other for the Eurasian Union. The Eastern Partnership embodies this kind of expansionist liberalism of the EU and of the West in general, at least in Moscow's eyes. And there's this contrast between expansionist liberalism on the one hand, embodied by the EU and the Eastern Partnership, and on the other hand, Moscow's emphasis on common, or authoritarian, post-Soviet values and identity. Now here's the irony. The EU doesn't actually care that much about the Eurasian Union, but it does see it in instrumental terms. In response, for example, to Russian calls for coordination between the EU and the Eurasian Union, single Euro space, a Euro-Asian space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, the EU, in my opinion, has made the fundamental miscalculation that they can make this dialogue conditional on implementation of the Minsk agreement over Ukraine. They've been given the raspberry by the Russians, but actually I think the Russians are in fact laughing at this because they think these guys are suckers, man. But we'll see. Now, part of the problem, that Juncker's approach doesn't just come out of thin air. It also reflects a rough EU consensus that the Eurasian Union is not particularly threatening, and that in any event, the EU has far more important priorities to be worrying about. The refugee crisis, most obviously, but a whole other series of problems as well. Similarly, the EU doesn't really mind too much the Russian notion of a single economic space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. It doesn't think it's a practical proposal, but it thinks, hey, it's not very threatening. You know, why should we be worried about this? Just ignore it, basically. The United States. Now, the crisis in Russia-US relations has significant implications for the Eurasian Union and for Eurasian integration. Now, clearly there is no early prospect of reconciling the very different visions of Washington and Moscow. But because the Kremlin remains committed to to challenging the legitimacy of US leadership and asserting Russia's rights in its neighborhood. Conversely, many people in Washington regard, like the Eurasian Union, as an attempt to re-Sovietize the region, or at the very least, reassert Russian strategic and normative hegemony over the post-Soviet space. They therefore utterly reject its legitimacy, the Eurasian Union's legitimacy. But at the same time, the United States is a peripheral player in relation to the Eurasian Union. Washington's interest in the post-Soviet space, such as it is overwhelmingly focused on Ukraine, the Baltic states, to some extent Georgia, and we'll see about southern Central Asia, but that's, I think, an open question. So now we come to the really important external player, namely China. Now, for much of the Putin era, Moscow and Beijing have reached a kind of accommodation in Central Asia. The Chinese have expanded their economic influence, but not attempted to establish any kind of meaningful political or security presence. They've also been smart enough to talk up Russia as the regional leader. And in return, Moscow hasn't tried too hard to obstruct Chinese economic interests. However, I think this accommodation is coming under growing strain. Over the past 12 to 18 months, Beijing's domination of the Sino-Russian strategic partnership, so-called, has become increasingly evident. More specifically, as we've already discussed a little bit, the Chinese are proceeding full steam ahead on the One Belt, One Road project, including the Silk Road economic belt. And now, I think the implementation of such ideas, now implementation is a big word, we'll see how much of it, how quickly it is implemented. But if there is full implementation, it will have major geopolitical implications for the post-Soviet space and, of course, the Eurasian Union. Now, as has been pointed out, Beijing has tried to allay Russian concerns. We've talked about the May 2015 agreement, where the two countries formally declared that One Belt, One Road and the Eurasian Union, far from being competing projects, are actually complementary. But here's the rub. China's extraordinarily rapid expansion into Eurasia, economic though it's labeled as, is creating its own strategic logic. And if OBOR is fully implemented, it will expose the Eurasian Union's flaws and relative lack of substance. And it's interesting that Kazakhstan and Belarus are already looking to Beijing, not Moscow, for economic impetus. And so, although the Chinese really do not wish it to be so, One Belt, One Road represents the single greatest external threat to Putin's vision of the Eurasian Union. And while Moscow and Beijing are committed to managing these latent tensions, there is, I think, potential for trouble down the road, given deteriorating economic circumstances in Russia and also China, given succession uncertainties in Kazakhstan and also Uzbekistan, by the way, and the very rapid growth of China's economic ties and influence with all the ex-Soviet republics. Raffaello Pantucci, someone at the Royal United Services Institute, spoke about China's inadvertent empire. Well, we'll see. Even if that's not a reality, perceptions are dangerous here. So what's the scorecard? To what extent has the Kremlin been able to achieve its political, security, economic, normative aims here? I think we've got to be fair. We've got to recognize that the Eurasian Union has been in existence only for a relatively short time. So these are early days. Judgments and assessments can change. But I would say this. I think generally, and this is not just a problem with the Eurasian Union, I think generally Moscow has limited capacity to enforce its writ in the post-Soviet space. It can certainly destabilize its neighbors. It can stop people from doing things, but it cannot guarantee Russian political, security, and economic interests, as we have seen. Indeed, I would argue that with few exceptions, Russian influence in the post-Soviet space is actually in decline, partly because of the hunger for sovereignty among the ex-Soviet republics, but also because of the rise of external actors and influence, in particular China. Now, if we look at the Eurasian Union's objectives and we think, well, strategic footprint, I think we see declining strategic influence. Putin's vision of the Eurasian Union has not been able to transcend the realities that I've mentioned. Over the past 10, 15 years, Russia has lost much of its hegemony in Eurasia. The ex-Soviet republics are increasingly assertive, skillful, and very possessive of their sovereignty. And China's economic power is, as I mentioned, translating into real strategic heft. Now, the notion that Russia can somehow carve out a dedicated strategic space for itself as the regional superpower, well, I think that's increasingly dubious, and that's putting it politely, as are its pretensions to be an independent centre of global power at the same level and with the same status as the United States and China. What about authoritarian international here? Now, this has been an area of relative success because Moscow has been quite successful in consolidating authoritarian like-mindedness. The likelihood of a colour Maidan-type revolution among Eurasian Union members is minimal, in my opinion. There's been it's part of a general trend of de-democratization across the region. But here's the downside. The success of authoritarian leaders in consolidating their authoritarianism has made them no more flexible. Authoritarian leaders, much more than their democratic counterparts, are extremely jealous about devolving any functions, any meaningful authority to another source. So they're not going to give it to Putin. Ironically, if they were more democratically minded, they might be more relaxed about the devolution of authority. But authoritarian leaders cling on like dear life. And in this connection, events in Ukraine have had two unfortunate consequences for Putin. They have first slowed down the momentum of Eurasian integration, and second, they have accelerated the outreach of the others, of Kazakhstan, and especially Belarus, to other external players. What about the economic side of things? The ongoing, in my opinion, the ongoing recession in Russia and the significant knock-on effects for Kazakhstan and Belarus have undermined the formal and most publicly acceptable rationale for Eurasian integration on Moscow's terms. The bottom line is this: if the Eurasian Union cannot deliver economic benefits to its members, the whole enterprise becomes delegitimized. And this problem has been exacerbated as a result of major disagreements over Russian and Eurasian Union counter-sanctions against the EU, particularly the way that Russia did it, arbitrarily, unilaterally. And Moscow's clampdown on, for example, the re-export by Belarus of goods has led to serious political tensions with Minsk. Now, while Moscow has been rather more successful in getting Kazakhstan to toe the line on this, its high-handed behavior has actually sharpened Kazakhstani resentment, and this resentment was already there because of the damage to local producers from the flood of Russian imports. In sum, the first year of the Eurasian Union has, to put it mildly, been somewhat troubled. The experience has exposed the limits of Russian influence, and it has demonstrated, so far at least, that Moscow, or Russia, has no demonstrable capacity to be the primary provider of regional prosperity. That's important. So why would people want to join unless they were forced to? So where is the future? What is the future of Eurasian integration? I think, generally speaking, Eurasia's importance to Russia will continue to grow in both absolute and relative terms over the next few years. I think also that Russia's future engagement in the broad Eurasian space is subject to multiple variables: succession outcomes in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the security situation in Afghanistan, Russia's relations with the West, the evolution or devolution of Sino-Russian partnership, and of course the vagaries of Russian domestic politics. All these are potential game changers, either singly or in combination with each other. Now, given this fluidity, it's it's rather hard to sort of say, this is the way it's going to go. So I'm going to leave you with three potential scenarios here. The scenarios for Eurasian integration and the future of the Eurasian Union, basically I call broad continuity, imperial activism, and recalibration. So continuity. Well, as the label says, this would see Moscow continue its present approach. So it would reflect a certain lack of will, lack of capacity in Moscow to pursue an active neo-imperial agenda, but also it would expose a lack of imagination to embrace a more enlightened, equitable, post-imperial approach. And so Moscow would kind of hold the line. It would continue to work with Eurasian elites. It would counter Western normative influence. It would pursue a mixture of cooperation and competition with the Chinese. And in this, it would be helped by diminishing Western interests, by the reluctance of post-Soviet elites to openly defy Moscow, and continuing strategic restraint in Beijing. You know, basically, the Eurasian Union would kind of potter along, helped by the absence of strategic shocks. Second scenario, imperial activism. Well, first, the problem with the continuity scenario that I've just outlined is that it depends on a lasting confluence of really lucky circumstances and the hope that change, if and when it happens, does so gradually and relatively smoothly. And I would argue that this view is ahistorical and underestimates the scope for strategic shocks in the region, the scope for strategic shocks to affect decision makers, not just in Russia, in Central Asia, China, and indeed elsewhere. So the alternative scenario here is a resurgent Russian imperialism. And the trigger here could be the political transformation in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Another game changer might be if China proceeded too quickly, too incautiously to translate economic influence into strategic presence, and with diminishing, of course, with diminishing sensitivity for Russian concerns. And if that happened, I really don't think that Moscow would take it lying down. Although it would look to avoid confrontation, it would seek to counter Chinese influence through various means, exerting direct pressure on the post-Soviet states, exploiting various sources of economic leverage, even reinforcing its military presence and undertaking some kind of military intervention. Worth mentioning that Eastern Ukraine, the percentage of ethnic Russians in Ukraine is 17%. In Kazakhstan, it's 23%. Just something to sort of keep in mind here. And what about the Eurasian Union in this scenario? Well, I think this time you would see a kind of 21st century Comic-Con. And then the third scenario, recalibration. Now, in the current climate, I accept it's really difficult to conceive that Russia would embrace a kind of post-imperial approach towards Eurasia. Yet I think that this scenario should not be ruled out. And one reason is the consciousness among much of the Russian elite that more forcible methods of projecting influence, they kind of haven't really worked out. And they're unlikely to be successful in the future, given the growing independence among the ex-Soviet republics, the activism and impact of major actors such as China, and indeed Russia's own domestic and foreign policy constraints. And so in these circumstances, the Kremlin might have the imagination or the will to find more creative ways of promoting Russian objectives. And here the Eurasian Union could be one such avenue, but obviously on a much less Moscow-centric and more equitable basis. Russia, in this scenario, would continue to reap the benefit of long-standing advantages, close political ties, economic complementarities, cultural and civilizational affinities, and the virtue of being distinct from a moralizing, sanctimonious West and a disconcertingly powerful China. I think in the end, the only relative certainty is that Russia faces a difficult and protracted process of strategic adaptation if it is to sustain its position in Eurasia and make the Eurasian Union a going concern. And I think this will require three things. This will involve treating the ex-Soviet republics as sovereign partners rather than as ex-imperial subjects. Second, it will entail sensitivity on the modalities of regional cooperation. And third, and possibly most important, it will mean valuing engagement and integration for its own sake rather than seeing Eurasia primarily as a theatre of great power and normative contestation. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Let me start with the first one. You've obviously talked about the asymmetries and the relative importance of the economic and political aspects of this. Let's imagine for a moment, although it's not very likely, but there is an economic recovery. Oil prices go up, sanctions, are lifted, Russian sanctions. In other words, that the economic picture looks brighter. Let's say in 2 years' time. Would that have, how much of an impact would that have, given, as you've said, the different agendas of the different members, but obviously this year, 2014, was not a good year because of the economic problems. Would a much brighter economic situation change some of the things you've said?
A brighter economic situation clearly would make a difference. After all, as I mentioned, the primary motivation for Kazakhstan and Belarus in having anything to do with the Eurasian Union is economic. So fix that problem, if you like, they're going to be more amenable. But not so amenable to the point that they're going to cede real sovereignty. And I think that's the critical point. That's the point that Moscow has to understand. I mean, if I were trying to play Russia's hand, I would say, focus on your own game. So focus on recovery. Be a model, in a sense, for a kind of modernization. Call it authoritarian modernization if you like. But be moving in some kind of positive direction. And then you will start to draw Kazakhstan and Belarus back. But it's important not to act too precipitately, not to be too eager. You also, in this, Russia would benefit, as I mentioned right at the end, from the fact that in many ways the West is not a particularly attractive partner for Kazakhstan and particularly Belarus. And that people, it's not just Russians who worry about China, Kazakhstan and Belarus, they also worry about it because it's seen as so monolithic. It's this kind of unstoppable juggernaut. So I actually don't think that Russia has to do that much to, in a sense, at least arrest the negative dynamic. But when I say it doesn't have to do that much, what much it has to do is really about mending its own game. Well, okay. Alex? Yeah. Oh. So, shall I take a bunch of... Yeah? Yeah? Yeah.
Bobo, that was really wonderful overview on so many levels. I want to engage just on one kind of assumption, which is a very logical assumption in your argument, and that's about sort of these states zealously guarding their sovereignty, check, I'm with you, but then calculating the need to sort of hedge against Russia, diversify, and so forth. Mm-hmm. All that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Totally also wrote a book on it and everything. But here's what I'm starting to see, maybe to sort of question that just a little bit. We're seeing tremendous clouds of uncertainty in the region, right? The regional economic collapse, collapse of remittances with the value of the ruble, concerns about ISIS, whether justified or not, I think they're actually sincerely felt, given the media environment. You know, a sense of deep uncertainty on the security and on the economic front, and in almost this type of kind of Stockholm syndrome, right? Where do you turn to in conditions of deep uncertainty, right? Do you turn back to the patron? And so, in a weird way, all of these should be pushing the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks to think seriously about their alignments and choices and architectures, and yet maybe it's also having the opposite effect. So I just sort of throw that out.
Right, okay, great. Mark.
Thank you very much. I agree. That's a wonderful overview and very, very insightful. I just wanted to emphasize what you said about Nazarbayev and his interest in the Eurasian Union very strongly, because it comes back to a tension in Eurasianism that I tried to highlight in my own presentation, and that is, on the one hand, you have the Russian attitude of using Eurasianism to reestablish a kind of Russian leadership that was perceived to have been lost, which is, I think, a genuine kind of follow-through in a Eurasian tradition. But Nazarbayev, who preceded that, and that's what's interesting, already in the 1990s, was picking up on a different, and this is, I think, why he picked up on Eurasianism, why he came up with the idea out of the blue, as it were, of Eurasianism, because he saw that, and looking back also at the experience, at the legacy that I talked about this morning, he saw there the opposite. He saw there precisely the post-colonial promise, and it was precisely a way of solidifying and guaranteeing the sovereignty they had won. After the collapse of the Soviet Union. But and what I'm trying to say is that this was, in a way, it's a very legitimate, it's an equally legitimate part of the Eurasianist legacy. So you have it can be different things, and very different things. Just one small detail on this point, and that is that it just occurred to me as I was thinking, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan might have picked up on this in particular because their Eurasianism was mediated to such a large extent through Gumilyov. And Gumilyov was outstanding and almost singular. I didn't mention this in my talk, but I might have. Almost singular in his rejection or failure to pick up on the notion of a great Russian priority in Eurasianism, and an almost utopic notion of Druzhba Narodov and of sharing. And of course, they named their university after Gumilyov, and so they picking up on that strain or that version, that iteration of Eurasianism laid that. So I think it's an extremely important point. Two legitimate, conflicting, but nevertheless legitimate perspectives coming out of the Eurasian tradition.
Okay.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. It really gave significant food for thought. My two very short questions about Eurasian Union. Very first, when the idea was conceived, about 5-6 years ago, obviously, like Putin had Ukraine in mind, because Ukraine would be the jewel crown of Eurasian Union. So do you think that without Ukraine, the entire idea and the policies are pretty vacuous, and in the longer term, this idea and the Union will fizzle away, because obviously, so Ukraine will never join Eurasian Union. That's obviously clear now. Because politically the country is completely lost, which is really a very welcome development, even if it came at formidable price. And the second one, how do you think that this is a long term, but in the shorter term, to what extent domestic dimension is influencing Russian foreign policy? Because even if Eurasian Union turns out to be not very efficient, it's like they drain on the resource, still Putin has to show to his population that he really matters, that he is the really influential power. And for many Russians, even though the idea was that Eurasian Union is no Soviet Union, obviously it is not, but in the mind of many Russians, it's still the sort of reincarnation, because we got at least some of the countries back. At least they are now ours. They're not politically part of our Russian Federation, but at least they're under our influence. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'll take one more.
Hi. Quick question. You did mention sort of the other organization that's really interesting in this economic case, which is the BRICS. So how do you see sort of, Putin as the great reconstitutor to bring together places that maybe geographically don't make quite as much sense to this bad Western world, and facilitating sort of those economic unions, and how do you see that working towards his whole striving for legitimacy?
Okay, that's great. Well, look, I'll take those four quickly. Alex, essentially your question, it seems to me, comes down to, in this increasingly volatile, scary world and also regional environment, what do? Do you diversify, hedge, or do you go back to daddy? And I think the problem is, daddy is not as strong as he used to be. He's not as rich as he used to be. So that the danger here would be you'd cede control, cede sovereignty, but not get the economic goodies, not get the protection. And I think that's a concern. So that's why I mean, all choices are bad. Some are just less bad than others. And I think going back to daddy would be the worst choice. At least it's seen as the worst choice. Yeah. Mark, I think, you know, that point that you made earlier today, I thought was absolutely fascinating, really. And I think Nazarbayev does look at that, and I think that does present a model under which Eurasian integration, Eurasian Union could work. It clearly, you know, the modalities will be extremely complicated. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But that's why I'm reluctant to dismiss the Eurasian Union and Eurasian integration out of hand. On Ukraine, 2 points about this. I think they will proceed anyway without Ukraine. If you could somehow make the Eurasian Union relatively functional, at least if it were going in, broadly speaking, the right direction, it became a more or less attractive model, an attractive framework, then Ukraine might not be that crucial after all. Then I want to attack, or attack's a big word, but challenge your assumption that Ukraine will never come back to Russia or a Eurasian world. I think certainly Putin has not given up. I think he thinks that he's calculating that Ukraine is so dysfunctional, they're going to mess it up. The Europeans are too distracted, and the Americans, well, they're too worried about the presidentials and all sorts of other stuff. Who cares about Ukraine? Even the Ukrainians don't seem to be caring that much about Ukraine. So here's the problem. So what I worry about, if I were looking at it from a Ukrainian perspective, is that I don't think the deal is done. I think there's still something to play for. More importantly, Putin thinks there's something to play for. On the BRICS. The problem with the BRICS, I've got something coming out, sort of a crude advertisement here, called Russia, China and the BRICS. It should come out in about a month or so. Now, the problem with the BRICS is that Russia sees the BRICS as the basis of an alternative model of global governance, but none of the other BRICS do. And that's the bottom line. So, in other words, Russia can continue to push this line, but the Chinese, the Indians have no interest in either global leadership and certainly not in using the BRICS, identifying the BRICS as some kind of non-Western, dare one say, anti-Western, anti-US bloc. And I know Russia has denied that it's trying to do this, but that's the perception. And so those sensitivities will really undermine the effectiveness of the BRICS. I have to say also that the Chinese don't really believe very much in the BRICS as a new development mechanism. It's quite interesting that, yes, I know there's been a lot of fanfare about the new development bank, but the Chinese invest 85% of Chinese aid, overseas aid, is dealt through bilateral channels. And then the Chinese are favoring, among multilateral channels, One Belt, One Road, Silk Road Fund, and of course the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In other words, they're going for made in China mechanisms, not this sort of fluffy, BRICS-y sort of stuff. You know. Shall I take a few more? 3 more, okay. And then, can I, Charlotte? Yeah.
First.
And I'll come to you. Oh, all right, yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Bill Veal. I wanted to ask you about kind of a reverse flow sort of question here. The agreements that Kazakhstan signed with Russia allowed for migration of labor, unimpeded flows of labor. Have you seen any signs that Russian capital and Russian labor, skilled labor, for example, has gone to Kazakhstan? And I raise this because the Kazakhstanis in selling their move into the EU, we're saying that we're going to be the better platform for foreign investors to come into and locate their businesses. Now that hasn't exactly worked out given the currency differences and so forth, but I'm asking if you have seen any signs that Russians were moving into Kazakhstan, not so much as little green men or something of that sort, but whether there was a kind of individuals moving in there to seeing better investment opportunities, better growth opportunities than in Russia.
Okay. Charlotte?
Thank you very much, Professor Bobo, for such a kind of very interesting speech. My question, I have very short two questions. First of all, which will be more priorities from your three analyses? The second, I know that for such kind of very interesting analysis, of course, the circumstance and the background is very complicated. And for example, not only the short term, the conflict, violence, unprecedented the changes, and also long term, the political, economic, long term, the circles changes.
Yep.
So what kind of an element you prefer emphasize for your analysis?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So,
Yes, Bobo, two things. One on, there's been a depiction of contrasting, the splits and the problems between Russia and China with the undertones that this is going to be advantageous to those who would like to see Putin taken down and the EU, weakened. But it seems to me that the relationship between Russia and China, whatever their problems are, and there are a lot of difficulties there, is much stronger than any relationship they have with the United States, partially because of the fact you talk to military people today, and they talk about realistic possibilities of war with Russia and war with China. People are talking about the South China Sea crisis as maybe the Ukraine crisis for Asia, and everybody is aware of that. So that whatever their problems are, I think they're really kind of joined at the hip in one sense. Secondly, economically, this is a situation of tremendous growth because of the Belt and Road more than the economic union, which is creating a sense of optimism in that whole section of the world. We have nothing to offer that. We are in crisis. Anybody who read the New York Times yesterday realizes that the system is bankrupt. There is too much debt in this system which cannot be paid. Yesterday, the New York Times admitted that. I've been saying that for a long time. So we really have nothing to offer to them. So the only thing we should do, and President Xi has offered cooperation on this, is to join this and to try and build up the world. But as our policy seems to be that we got to be the bosses, we take over, and these guys who are growing, both China and Russia, are a problem, and we should try and undercut them. They've had tremendous response within BRICS. I know BRICS is still not a very strong thing, but it has created a tremendous amount of optimism, and I disagree. I think that President Xi, on his visit in Fortaleza and in Latin America, on the BRICS, was offering a tremendous amount of infrastructural development there, and I think that's the way they want to go. So you've got, effectively looking at the world map, 40% of the world who says we want to move in this direction towards development, towards infrastructure investment, and not economic crisis that they see in both Europe and the United States. And I think if you look at it in that terms, there's a lot more strength in Russia's ability to develop this economic union and in the relationship between China and Russia for creating a new paradigm for the world.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go backwards. First, your intervention. I don't agree. And I don't agree on a number of levels. You may think that things are bad here, but really, would you rather be living in a Russian economy today, at this moment? I don't agree that there is a sense of optimism about the Russian economy in Russia. The surveys constantly all show that people expect things to get worse. There is no great optimism about Russia's economic future, even among people who overwhelmingly support Putin and Russia's actions in Ukraine and Syria. So it's not only me who disagrees with you, I think they disagree with you. I think on the BRICS, the reason that the BRICS has any attraction at all, it's not about the BRICS, it's about China. People, rightly or wrongly, and often, I think ill-advisedly, they look at China and they see a kind of solution to their development problems. They do not see the BRICS as a solution to their development problems. And this is why the Chinese, and I don't think the Chinese do either, this is why the Chinese emphasize One Belt, One Road, why they emphasize the Silk Road Fund, why they emphasize the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's because they think if you want to do the job, if you want a job done well, ultimately you've got to take responsibility for it. Now, so other people, they don't look at Russia and they think, Russia, China, that's a model for cooperation. No, they look at China and they think that's a model for cooperation. On the movement of labor, I don't really get the sense that there is a Russian movement of labor into Kazakhstan. I think Kazakhstan is seen as a better business climate, but it's not that much better. It's less developed. It's even less law-based than for a lot of people, in the perceptions of many, than Russia. I think the one edge that Kazakhstan has, and it may not, excuse me, it may not last for very long, is that Nazarbayev is somehow seen as a more predictable leader, and this is a more predictable kind of authoritarianism than the rather sort of shock and awe type of authoritarianism pursued by Vladimir Putin. And this is the worry that you have here, is that Nazarbayev seems to have a clear sense of he has strategic choices available to him. They may be bad choices, or he may choose them mistakenly, but he has choices. I think there's a feeling that sometimes Putin runs out of strategic choices. And so when you have few attractive strategic options, what do? You go for tactical surprises. You go for tactical coups. You change the narrative. And this brings me to Shaolei's question. Which scenario is most likely? I was scared someone was going to ask me that, because I really don't know. Let me put it in broad percentage terms. I'd say 45 for continuity. I'd say 15, no, maybe 20 for a kind of post-imperial recalibration. But I mean, you've got to allow time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, obviously. So what does that add up to? 45, 50, 45, 20, 35. Is that right? Yeah. Maths was never my strong suit. So 20% for the aggressive approach, so the imperial activist approach. What's the single greatest variable here? I think the Kazakhstan succession. So if we assume that, okay, Nazarbayev departs the scene, and the new leadership is roughly of the same political persuasion. It's not radical. You know, they may be technocratic, but they're not Western liberal, democratic capitalist kind of people. So Western educated doesn't mean pro-Western. We've seen this with China, actually. So I think probably what will happen is you'll have more continuity than people imagine, which means that despite Putin associating Kazakhstan's national identity with the figure of Nazarbayev himself, I think Putin will not intervene if there's just a more or less normal succession. The danger, and this is where the 35% thing comes in, is if Kazakhstan does tilt to the West or become too beholden to Beijing, then he may think that this is a time to edge into northern Kazakhstan and create a new legitimacy. That's it.